Okay. Well, everyone, thank you very much for joining us. Good morning and welcome to you all. This is our 11th in our series of weekly forums focused on how we build enterprise resilience during COVID-19. And since we started back in March, we've come a long way together. We started with disruption, rapid response, and huge uncertainty. We moved to adaptation and resilience. And now I'm very pleased to say we are still innovating and we are still stretching our imagination around what our businesses can possibly become. So with over 80 people so far this morning, it's great to see so many of you again, and welcome to those of you joining us for the first time. I know it's half term, and that means we typically have slightly reduced numbers, and a lot of you must be juggling family demands, so thank you for joining. My name's Paul Middleton. I'm a Managing Director in Protiviti here in the UK, and I'm joined by colleagues from Protiviti UK and Robert Half in the UK too. This is our Protiviti and Robert Half collaboration forum, a forum for all of us to collaborate and learn from each other. And this is what we've hopefully achieved over the past few weeks and what we'll continue to achieve. We adapt the themes each week to meet what you tell us is important to you, but the aim remains consistent. The aim continues to be on discussing and learning from practical stories, insights, and innovations from how businesses and people such as ourselves have remained resilient and have met the changing challenges of COVID. And in doing that, hopefully some of you will be able to join the dots, hear those stories and match them to your own challenges, which will help in your own decision making and give you greater confidence to make those right decisions. So last week we heard from the finance industry, as well as the fast food industry, and how they're opening their doors and rapidly changing. This week we're going to begin to focus on some of the most compelling themes, the imperative and the opportunity for businesses to reimagine themselves as we enter this recovery phase, how we embrace the digital agenda rather than just being content with a digital veneer, and how we've got to manage the new risk and regulations that come from these changes, and also our changing need and desire for physical office space. We're going to explore these broad themes with senior panelists who bring a range of experiences, particularly from the insurance industry. That's a common theme for them all. And they're all seasoned professionals in managing large businesses and realigning them to rapidly changing requirements from customers, staff, regulators, and shareholders. So we'll be hearing from the COO of Brightside Insurance, a non-exec from Admiral, as well as the chair of EDAM Insurance Group. As normal, we're joined by Layla Tyndall from Robert Half to provide some global recruitment insight, as well as by Protiviti's Global Head of Digital and Innovation, Jonathan Wyatt, who will be adding a Protiviti perspective to the insights that we hear. So we have a busy agenda, some fantastic panelists, and I think there'll be some great inspiring stories. For those of you who don't know us, Protiviti is a change management consultancy focusing on technology, risk, and internal audit. We specialize in managing risks in your businesses, including operational resilience, and help you face the future with greater confidence. So it should be of no surprise that many people on this call are drawn from the risk world. And in collaboration with our parent company, Robert Half, we have a range of people from a number of different industries and types of roles. We have financial services, charity, manufacturing, food, public sector, retail, hospitality, media, and many more. Before we kick off, just as normal, a little bit on forum logistics. This is your forum. So please share your perspectives, ask your questions, disagree, agree with the panelists, and give your point of view. Please interact and make it as meaningful as you can for you and everyone else. You can ask those questions through speaking up and taking yourself off mute. And I think a lot of you are on mute at the minute, so you will need to unmute yourselves, or as many of you prefer, to use the chat function on the sidebar as well. For those of you who don't use Teams that often, you can highlight the chat bar by pressing Show Conversation, and you can type away and add your questions and your thoughts. For those of you dialing in, we have had some gremlins in the past where you haven't been able to unmute yourself. So if you are dialing in and you want to unmute yourself, please just press *6. So without further delay, we'll turn to the latest in our series of global recruitment barometers. And as I say, we call this a barometer because many of you have said that looking at that recruitment world allows you to understand how the world is opening up and how we're changing week on week. So what Layla's brought each week is just a quick 2-minute summary on how that recruitment world is changing, which can hopefully just shine a light on how the different geographies and industries are recovering. So Layla, over to you for our quick briefing.
Thanks, Paul. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see so many people joining us. So how are you feeling? I'm feeling certainly a lot more positive this week. The sun's shining, and I think we're beginning to turn a corner in this crisis. So at Robert Half this week, we're preparing to open our offices. Globally now, most of our offices are open with stringent guidelines. And in the UK, we are certainly preparing to open the majority of our offices, and people are starting to come back. So we look at one of our key measurements is job flow. So this week, the numbers are positive. So our temporary numbers are up 23% week on week. That means we're kind of back up to about 50% of pre-COVID revenue. And very good news on our perm business. Bear in mind, this is a bank holiday week, so we're 1 day short. Our perm business has picked up to 55% pre-COVID, and there's a 27% uptick on last week on job flow. So that's a significant number for us. And I think it's a sure sign that we're definitely turning the corner. So key sectors that we're still seeing globally, where we're seeing hiring requirements: manufacturing, packaging, service, IT, education, financial services, facilities management, housing, construction, logistics, online retail, healthcare, and pharma. Globally, China and Asia business have been pretty much back up to near 100%, and America, the US business is still going very strong. So where are we seeing the hires? Our senior executive search practice is still going very well, particularly in the US and in Europe. And we are seeing a huge uptick on digital and technology. So conversations this week around, I think people have shored up their cash now. There are still some key hires on finance. Interestingly, we're seeing roles on FP&A, that's financial planning and analysis. That's usually 6 months later after we're coming out of a recovery, but we are seeing those types of job title roles coming in now, which means that some sectors are really focused on the next few months. They're focused on margin, budgeting, forecasting, and need some help with that. But digital is the big area. The last couple of weeks, we've seen a huge surge in demand for digital and tech. So what does that mean? I think it's telling us there's a mixed landscape as the government announces changes to the furlough scheme this week. And the IOD did a poll yesterday revealing that 25% of companies in the UK are saying they will not be able to pay staff when the furlough schemes start to finish. I think we're going to see a mixed landscape as we look at businesses right-sizing, rescaling, and upskilling. And I think we'll start to see a deployment of people from one sector to another as different sectors have different challenges as we pull out of this.
Super. Layla, thank you very much for that. So on to our panelists for today. I'd just like to introduce our panelists as normal team. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Richard Bevin from Brightside Insurance. Brightside is an insurance broker specialising in providing niche insurance. They offer products including private vehicle and home cover, policies for business premises, insurance for sports people, taxis, motorhomes, minibuses, couriers, hauliers, and many more. Richard is the COO of the Brightside Group, having joined in April 2019. Before joining Brightside, Richard was an executive director at Swinton Group, responsible amongst other things for delivering group-wide digital transformation. And prior to that, held senior roles at Lloyds Banking Group, Reuters, Bank of New York, and Barclays. We're delighted he can join us today. Next, I'd like to introduce Matthew Deering. Matthew is a senior private equity professional with 20 years experience in corporate finance, restructuring, turnaround, and special situations investment. He now provides executive and non-executive services to a range of businesses, two of which are Edam Insurance Group and Moda Furnishings. Matthew is the chairman at Edam Group, the largest privately owned credit hire and post-accident services provider, providing courtesy cars to people after a motor accident. He's also a non-executive director at Moda Furnishings, which sells luxury garden furniture UK-wide with showrooms in Manchester and Surrey. Again, delighted that Matthew can join us today. Keith is our next panelist. Keith is the newly appointed Chief Risk Officer for a large fund management company, as well as a non-executive director at Admiral Group PLC. Keith has previously held positions as Chief Risk Officer and Chief Resilient Officer for M&G PLC, where he coordinated their COVID response, as well as Group Head of Audit at Prudential, Chief Risk Officer at Prudential, and has held a variety of senior research and economist roles at investment banks. So Keith, thank you for joining us today. Lastly, we're joined by Jonathan Wyatt, who is Global Head of Protiviti Digital and Innovation, based in the UK. Jonathan's been with Protiviti for over 15 years and specialises in helping organisations manage the opportunities and both the challenges presented by disruptive innovation and exploring ways to embrace new and emerging technologies. And Jonathan, as in previous weeks, will be commenting on how we should approach innovation as we hear different perspectives from our panelists. So thank you all very much for joining us today. I know a couple of people have put their hand up in the chat forum. Please let me know if everything's okay there, or if you have particular questions, feel free to put your hands up. I don't know if you mean to. Sometimes people press the wrong button to do that, but please just check that. So on to our panelists then. Richard, if I may start with you, sir. Can you give us some insight into how, as a telephony-based insurance broking business, you've adapted and innovated to meet those challenges of COVID, and how your future business model is likely to be changing, please?
Thanks, Paul, and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. I'm really, really pleased to be here. I cannot count now how many calls I've done from my bedroom in London, so that's why I have a background on, because I'm sure you're not very thrilled by my wardrobes. Anyhow, so the business model. Well, we live in interesting times. 12 weeks ago, 14 weeks ago, whatever, we were sitting there saying, if this really hits us hard, what are we going to do, and how are we going to get 507 people working from home? Because at that point we had absolutely no idea. We took a very firm line. We followed the government guidance, and we sat there and said, we must do this to protect our people, to protect our business. That there is no choice. This idea that we might be able to sort of stumble through with offices half open, we said that wasn't the answer. So we put the right people around the problem and sweated it for 5 weeks, and at the end of 5 weeks, through some very bumpy days, nights, and completely implemented 2 different contact center platforms, soft phone technology, buying equipment, you name it. We gave everybody a bag of kit and a nice letter and said, please take this and go and see if we can make it all work at home. And people, with a mix of our technology, home technology, we managed to make it work. I couldn't be more proud of that, because it's I think it's been safe for our people, and what we've been able to do is, because it worked, is serve our customers all the way through this. And of course, that's the number one thing. Yes, we detuned our hours a bit just to not deal with complexities of shift patterns and things, and we protected obviously our existing customers, so we detuned new business, as painful as that has been financially. So so we have got everybody working from home, and that was kind of big tick. I never would have believed that we could achieve that. Of course, I'm giving my IT times guys a very, very hard time indeed now, and say, well, if you can build a virtual working from home model in 5 weeks, why is it going to take 9 months to install a new contact center platform and all that sort of stuff? So what's it done for us? One is it's proved a number of things. It's the kind of largest live experiment I think we've done, and I suspect many businesses have ever done. So I think for me, it's proven a little bit of actually customers' habits are changing. We have been quite a traditional business. The majority of our offline niche business is a telephony-based business. Our online business is, and the digital bit of our business is mainly our car business. So the rest are much more traditional. Customers call us, we call them sort of business. Not much digitization in the sense of the customer experience as opposed to the whole company. And I think if you'd asked the DNA of the organization, was this is what our customers want, and that's what we are good at. And actually the reality is, I think customers have learned, because they've had to be digital in ways that they never expected to be. It doesn't matter whether you're 18 or 80. I think we've learned from customers that, you can't speak to your bank on the phone. They are completely and utterly out of service. You can't speak to any of your telco providers. So the only way you can get service for many things is to do it digitally, do it online, and pay for it online. So I think we've seen, and we need to test this properly with customers, a major shift in the way that customers want to and are willing to be dealt with. So that gives us some opportunities. I think the second area is our people, who no one would have said, let's all go work from home as a big experiment, but we've done it. And I think I've just done sort of coffee chats with about 300 of the team over the last few weeks. You know, how are you feeling? What's it like? And I guess if I could sum it up, I think I've got about 15% of the team that would say, please never make me come back to the office. I love working from home. I absolutely want to stay there. I think at the other end of the scale, I've got 15% of the people who are saying, I want to go back tomorrow. I'm absolutely hating this. What's interesting is there are more managers saying they want to be back in the office than I think there are some of our frontline folks. And certainly people who have very specialist skilled jobs, like many of my tech team, you know, are saying they are much more protective. They're much happier at home. They don't like the introductions because they want to focus on things like testing or whatever they're building. And then you've got the core, who I think are very mixed, who are saying actually some sort of balance. So we've got 3 completely empty offices being closed for 5.5 weeks. I wouldn't restart them tomorrow. We've given no date as when we're going to do it. And we said that this is about safety first, and we're working it, and it's working okay. So we're going to stay working from home. I guess a number of other things are really then coming to mind is, okay, so what is our future model going to be? Yeah, we're a business that's grown up from a series of businesses. The reason why we're in Torquay, for example, is that was our taxi business that we bought years ago, and it's sat there. So I think we've got a massive opportunity to do things here. And when I talk about digitization, I don't just mean a better quote and buy journey and getting customers to use portals. I mean getting post out of this business, stopping all sorts of stuff that, you know, bit of old fashioned stuff that we now need to change because it doesn't work in this new world. It means that we can start to blend and mix our skills. So traditionally, we'd have hired someone into Torquay to support our business there. Now I've started hiring already from anywhere. Actually, we've done our first adverts this last week just to hire people from anywhere. So we'll see how that goes. And we started to cross-train people that once were in Torquay and once in Southampton, once in Bristol. We started to cross-train them. And again, experimenting. We've learned that we can do virtual learning. I mean, who knew that? We had to retrain our SME team to do some particular compliance stuff. We retrained 90 people over the course of 2 weeks virtually. So a lot to talk about, but I think, you know, it is giving us a real opportunity, despite the challenge of doing this, to rethink our model, to think, you know, are we ever going to be back in offices? What sort of offices will we be in? What's our EVP for our people? And all of that stuff is what we're hard thinking about at the moment, Paul. I think you're on mute, Paul.
Paul, you're on mute.
While Paul's coming back, I'll just jump in, Richard and Jonathan here with just a quick question from you around some of your experience. And I think you talked a little bit, and it was one of the topics we actually talked a bit about last week around, and you made the specific comment, if you could do something so quickly, why does it normally take us months to drive change and to do things? And I think one of the questions I think that was out there is, how do we sustain, I guess, some of the cultural change and some of the experiences we've had, and make that sort of our standard way of doing things? I'm interested in some of your thoughts as to how you make some of, I guess, what you've experienced recently the standard way of doing things rather than the crisis management way of doing things.
That's a great question. I think one of the things that we've learned about is, you know, how we assess risk and what we are prepared to accept, and how much of that was just in the DNA of, you know, here's our particular risk profile. We've never really thought about it that hard, but, you know, why did things take so long? A lot of it is tied up in risk and decision-making processes that just take way too long. And, you know, analyzing to death and not making a different outcome, but just putting people through the pain of more and more analysis. So I think it's, how do we get that balance right? I mean, so for example, working from home, lots and lots of stuff to worry about, you know, worrying about protecting customer data, worrying about, you know, what happens if people do bad stuff. But actually, when you stand back and think about it, people do bad stuff at the office. You know, you love to think that you can protect everything. You can't. And is it really going to be that much worse working at home? So I think we've had a lot of heart searching about, you know, where we are willing to accept risks and where we're not. So that's one bit. And I think the decision making process speeded up extremely. You know, one of the things that we had is a much faster decision making process. So I ran, the working from home thing. Literally, me and Exco met every single morning. Every decision that I needed to get an Exco a decision made on, we had that readily available. And that's one of the things we've been thinking about, is how do we stop doing everything by set piece once a month, all sorts of things, and actually speed some of this stuff up. And I think we've also, we've been very, because of our history of not perhaps doing things very well, we've been very, as a business, wanting to do things well. So we tend to be letter of the law business. But actually, when you start to unpick some of those things, some of the stuff that's guidance, we've treated as law. And therefore we said, hang on a minute, what do we do about checks? What do we do about post? Can we change the model? Because if we started this as a purely digital business, you wouldn't think about, how am I going to accept checks? You just wouldn't. So therefore, why do we do that? I know it's a silly point, but I think when we talk about digital, it's very, everyone gets terribly excited about quote and buy journeys and websites and SEOs and all that sort of stuff. At the other end of the scale, if you're a business like mine, which is slightly old fashioned, trying to digitize, you've got to worry about that sort of stuff and saying, we've just got to change that. And it's kind of interesting. Again, I think customers, we've always argued that we would lose the customer if we didn't accept a check. Well, the answer is, what we now see is the effort that we need to go through for that one or two or small numbers of customers where they pay us by check. It's just not worth it in the round. And I know that sounds really harsh, but so few customers now, I'm not talking about vulnerable ones, you have to treat those particularly careful, but most customers now have alternative means and ways of making payments, and they've had to learn to do that. So again, I think it's giving us more impetus to do some of those things that we'd have put in the too risky, too difficult, might hit income camp.
And just a couple of quick comments, and Paul, I think you're back on, so I'll let you pick up. But you made an interesting comment around risk, and it's been very much one of my hot topics with many of my clients around risk and risk culture, and the reality of digital is one of the biggest risks arises from not doing things and not transforming and not changing. But risk management is often the function that is all about risk avoidance, and therefore that becomes a suggestion not to do things and why we shouldn't do things and why we should be cautious and why we should be careful, when actually most digital leaders are significant risk takers and will try things and are happy for things to fail as long as they're learning from that. And I think it's something that many organizations have got to look at and ask whether or not they're taking more risk. The other interesting comment you made was around digital, and we talked a bit about technology and what you were saying, but so much of digital is about a mindset and a culture and not about the technology. It's a different way of thinking, and it's a different mindset and a different culture throughout an organization, and that's really, in my mind, what digital transformation is about. But Paul, I'm conscious of time, so I'll let you
no, that's very useful, Jonathan, because I think that picks up on a point that Amanda's made in the chat as well about increasing risk appetite, and I think we'll definitely come back to that. I'm keen to bring Matt in as well, because Matt, I know that from your perspective, I think that major shift in how customers wish to be dealt with, I think has played a part in how you've approached things from an EDAM perspective. Can you just kind of build, I think, a little bit on what Richard has said and reflect on how you've dealt with those COVID challenges at EDAM and how you've been planning and approaching the post-COVID business model, please?
Yeah, sure. Morning, everyone. So I'm chairman of EDAM, which is involved in credit hire, which I suspect some people on the call will know quite a lot about. But for those that don't, that's the provision of courtesy cars to not at fault drivers effectively. And the challenge of their business model, if you like, on an ordinary basis is that the hires that you're making today, the cars you're putting in people today, you're incurring the cost today, but the settlement period with insurers can be quite extended. It can run to a year or even longer in plenty of situations. So you have this rather strange cash cycle and balancing the demands of sort of growth and profitability on one side and how you manage your working capital on the other is quite challenging, I think, for everybody in the credit hire sector, not just EDAM. But as COVID hit that business, we had a few sort of challenges and concerns. I mean, one was simply that higher volumes dropped through the floor because the reality is if nobody's on the road, nobody's having any accidents, nobody needs any courtesy cars. So we did expect and we did see fairly quickly that higher volumes dropped down to nothing. So that did mean we had to hibernate and furlough a lot of our staff at that point involved in the front end operations. We did worry about whether cash settlements were going to dry up from insurers and how insurers would be able to respond to the challenges of working from home. Actually, we didn't see that happening, which I think is perhaps picking up a bit on Richard's theme there. Insurers seem to manage the challenge of transitioning to working from home quite well, and we didn't see a lot of sort of business interruption in our recoveries and settlements teams. So that was good. Ultimately that meant the cash has kept coming in, so we haven't had to worry about having a big cash gap in our ongoing operations. It's more actually been about trying to batten down the cost base while our ongoing revenues have been affected, and then work out how and when we want to re-emerge from the situation. And I think that's been the real opportunity that we tried to seize with EDAM, is to take this kind of breathe in moment to really think about the business and what we want to look like when we re-emerge. I think one of EDAM's issues for a long time has been that they're on a bit of a hamster wheel of, you're working at a certain level of volume of hires. They weren't really thinking about where they make money out of those hires in terms of net profitability, in terms of where their working capital goes and where their cost of that capital associated with that is. And so I think they were probably doing a lot of things that when you actually looked at it cold, didn't make great financial sense. But when you're on that hamster wheel and you're just trying to keep the volume going, it's often difficult to sort of break away from that. Your staff are geared up to working a certain way. Your customers are expecting you to act in a certain way and take a certain level of volume. This gave us an opportunity to break all that, because we've effectively slimmed down to doing no volume. So what we've done is a real analytical piece to look at exactly all of our business streams and where they make money, what working capital they tie up, and work out what makes financial sense for us. And I think we've then taken the insights from that and tried to build them into a whole scenario modelling of what level of volume do we want to build back with, how much growth do we want, what profitability do we want, what cash flow do we want, and present that to our board and shareholders to see what really fits with their view and ambitions for the business. And we've done some really great work, I think, on that in the last few weeks. Having the time and the space in the business to be able to do that has been a big opportunity, and I think we've got now the bones coming together of a real plan for how we want to re-emerge. So I think, definitely what we've tried to do is take it as an opportunity to think about how we restructure the approach to the way we do business, really.
Thank you for that, Matt. I think, Jonathan, that picks up, I think, on a point you made last week, that one of the biggest dangers we can have here is that we just have a stepping stone back into the old norm. And I think, Matt, what you're saying there is something that I think a lot of the people, I think that will resonate with a lot of the people here, that you've taken the time or the opportunity almost given by the disruption of COVID for your board to step back and actually reassess that business and reimagine that business. Jonathan, is that the kind of the big innovation you think people should be kind of embracing at this time?
I think a couple of quick thoughts. So my comment specifically, I think particularly as we're going into this phase of thinking about returning to the office, reopening offices, we've had a couple of comments about that and whether we do, whether we don't, and timing is being cautious about thinking that if you go back. So there's a recognition we've learned some things. There's some things we want to sustain. There's some things we want to do when we get back to the office, and we'll go back to our old ways. We'll start thinking about how we can pick up on some of the things we learned. And my big fear for many organisations is if they do go back to the old ways of doing things, they won't get back to where they want. And if they want to get to a new world and new business and new way of doing things, you've got to go straight there. And I think that's an important part. I do think part of the interesting thing, and I think one of the things Matt has taken the opportunity to do, which I don't know that I've always seen enough of, is people actually also thinking about where they want to be in the medium and longer term, because I think a lot of businesses have done a very good job of the crisis management elements of this. That has often resulted in a lot of innovative activity in what I'll describe as being the back office side of the business and the operation side. It hasn't always translated to the same level of creativity and innovation actually at the front of the business, in terms of products, services, solutions, business models, operating models, and some of those other elements. And in some industries, I think people have therefore just gone into shutdown mode. If their traditional business doesn't operate or doesn't function, or just accepted that the world has changed, as opposed to perhaps bringing the same level of creativity that people have to the operational sides of their business to their products and services. And I think there's opportunity there. But no, it's great to see, and I think many organizations need to be taking stock and really thinking now about what do they want to be when we return to a new norm, and I think many people accepting that should be something different than it was before.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I think stepping back to the old norm is then going to be a consistent theme I think we see over the course of the next few weeks. And just Keith, before I come to you, I wanted just to pick up on a few of the questions just coming through. Question here about, I think, Richard, it was you mentioning around how daily exco meetings have been used to speed up decision making. And I guess, Matt and Richard and Keith as well, and whether you see those decisions also moving closer to the front line, so almost kind of less thinking through the problem, but actually just making those decisions or empowering those frontline people to make the quicker decisions.
Yeah, absolutely, and certainly saw a lot of that during the move to working from home. People kind of stood up all of a sudden and stopped asking permission and got on with stuff. I mean, everyone knew the boundaries. No one did silly things. No one went off and spent the company's money when they shouldn't have done, and all that sort of stuff. But actually just getting on with some stuff and then coming back and saying, this is what I've done this. And every single one of them were good things, well done. And I think a lot of our managers have actually learned that actually this word empowerment that's so abused actually in many businesses means that people have to step up as well. It's not about what the senior leaders do to them, it's how they behave. And we saw people just step up like I've never seen before. And I think that's continuing to some extent. And I think now people are going back to, but I can't because the rules say this, or the guidance, not the rules. They can't break the rules. But I think that's quite a big cultural change that we've seen, and long may it continue.
So thank you for that. And I think, Matt, maybe then if you could just reflect on this as well, then, because another question here is that the pace of change and the innovation that Jonathan, Matt, and Richard, you've spoken about is fantastic. But will that have an impact on employee stress levels and burnout? And actually, how can we sustain this without having how can we sustain this energy, this innovation, this spirit without having an impact on employees in the long term?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, actually, because there's no doubt, the last few months and the next few months, as things sort of re-emerge and we look to get back to normal, there's a lot of stress involved and uncertainty involved for employees in that, and assuming that you can come up with some fancy new creative business model, while putting the sort of stress of delivering that on your staff is something that needs careful kind of appreciation, I think. We will have to, if I think about EDAM, get everybody re-energized around what the new plan is going to be. I think pulling people back into the office, we will do that to a certain extent. And I think for a business like EDAM, it will actually be quite helpful. It's quite, if I think about what it was like pre-COVID, it was a very buzzy environment, lots of telephony going on, but lots of close cooperation and team working. And, I think it is important we get some of that back quickly and, safely, obviously. But I do think we need to make sure that sort of culture that the business had before is kind of reignited a bit to fit the new normal. And I think if we can take people with us well in terms of what we want to do, then the plan that we've come up with should be deliverable.
I do think, Paul, there's one of the challenges as people do return and people try to balance the return to work and more flexibility, both in terms of people's time with homeschooling and all the other challenges that people face, and the positives that a lot of people have taken away from this and the desire to be more remote. How you deal with the hybrid, because one of the reasons we've been effective in recent times is because we've sort of become 100% remote. So everybody's virtual, everybody's digitally in the meeting, everybody is using technology, everybody's in the same position. Whereas when you suddenly move back to, half the people are having those side meetings in the office and the other half of the people are remote, or half the people are physically in a meeting. which has been very effective while we've all been virtual, and we've all been in front of screens, and we've all been talking to, but all of a sudden we've now got that dodgy little speakerphone in the middle of the room that the people remote are struggling to participate through. I think that needs careful thought and careful consideration. And I do think a lot of the comments around culture and driving culture and how we sustain and maintain what we've got, it won't happen by accident. Culture isn't just one of those things that you just hope will happen. I think it needs to be actively nurtured, and I do think many organisations have got to have a plan as to how they're going to take the things they want to sustain and work them, not just rely on, well, this has been great, I hope it continues and I hope it carries on.
Well, Jonathan, thank you for that, because let's take that theme then, because I'm very keen to bring Keith into this as well, because so often that culture is defined by the bricks and mortar of our offices, and our culture becomes, or it can become, a slave to that. So Keith, I'd like to turn to you then, just to begin to focus on the question, which I'm sure that Matt and Rich will have an opinion on as well, about the future of the office. At both Admiral and M&G, you have large numbers of employees who've been traditionally office-based. Can you give us some insight into how you're seeing that thinking evolve around the future of the office, please?
Yeah, happy to, and good morning, everybody. I'd just like to go through on a couple of things that Rich and Matt have said, because I've got a reinforcing perspective as well. I think one of the things we've seen it has been the increased use of automation and digitalisation. But I think slightly different to Jonathan's view, I think that has been at the customer end for where I've been working. We've seen increased chatbots. I think the man from the Pru used to knock on the door of an old age pensioner. That can't happen now. And so it's now the video conference from the Pru. And to Richard's point, the customer habits have changed. These people are very willing and open to this form of channel. And I think we've leapt enormously, accelerated 4 or 5 years of consumer patterns in the space of a few months. So I think that's a really important point, that you may not be creating new products at the moment, but new distribution is a really big form at the moment. The second one is on the agile working. I couldn't agree more with what both Jonathan and Matt have said. Richard and Matt have said about decision making, risk acceptance, quick decisions. But I think the other thing that we've learned is if you focus on one thing, you reduce the number of things you're focusing on, you can do things a lot quicker and better than trying to do a whole range of things and only achieving 80% of everything. And that's one of the things that I think you take from this. It's not just quicker decision making and greater risk acceptance, but don't try to do too much. Try and do it in bite-sized chunks. And that again can help with the stress levels. You deliver something, you celebrate it, you learn from it, you move on. So they would be just two perspectives on that. The other one I just want to throw in before we get to footprint is outsourcing. And I don't know how many firms have outsourcing. That's been a real eye-opener to us. Where there are outsourcing arrangements, they have been the weakest link in the chain. We have all been able to control our own ability to work from home, but outsourcers, particularly those overseas, we've really struggled with. Every firm and company I've been involved with is one of those. And I think that needs a dramatic rethink. At the very least, it's rethinking your oversight of them and checking they can be prepared. We end up having to buy laptops for an IT company to provide service for us. I mean, it was quite bizarre. But actually, I also think it's going to bring particularly critical services are going to certainly come back in country and possibly even back in-house, because you cannot afford to all the good work you do in-house to be brought down by an outsourcer. So that I think is another one firms need to think about. And then perhaps on the footprint, I agree. There is a hybrid model that I think needs to happen, because we can't forget there are some roles that are performed better in the office. There are certain areas of technology that you need. That's why offices were created. People had access to technology and people and thought. And you can't quite get that at home. We talk about keeping the plates spinning for customer services. Everyone's done a fantastic job. But if you go and look at actually what happens, you've got a guy on a laptop in a shared bedroom flicking between 4 screens, when in the offices he's got 2 or 3 screens up. That isn't as efficient, and that is actually quite stressful, again, to the point. So there are those services. There's those services like trading services, where you get a richness of decision from having other people around you and sensing and discussing issues, which you can't do on an ad hoc basis by teams. You can arrange calls and you can have lots of information flow when it's understood and organised, but that serendipitous or that vibe type thing, again, means certain people will need to go back to the office. or will be more effective if they go back to the office. So you know, I totally agree with Jonathan. You can't just go back out of default and then try and grow, but you've also got to recognise that home working cannot always work, regardless of the ability to cope at the moment. I think the last thing I just want to say, and it is to this culture point, I think that whatever you do in this does give an explicit or implicit signal of what your values are as a company. And that's fine, but as long as you go into it consciously. And I think going back to the office will be one of those key decisions that people will pick up on, because there is, just looking across the companies I've been speaking to, there's 2 or 3 different models. One is the voluntary one, which sounds very much like Richard's case. You ask people what they want to do, and you typically end up with those that want to go back are often those that are least able to work from home because they're in a vulnerable situation, they're struggling with technology, they have homeschooling issues, whatever, and actually ultimately they're not the decision makers, because they're often the younger people. The exco are all in their nice big mansions with desks and offices and children at university. So, you know, the question is it directional from them, or is it actually people based? And that says a lot about a company, because the other way you go is critical services. Other people are sending critical services back into a business, i.e. the dealing desk or the operations, etc., because that is right for the customer and right for the business outcome. And again, I'm not saying that's not right, but what does that say about your values for the service, the efficiency, the effectiveness, and customers versus employees? And you've got to think, there's no right or wrongs, but you've got to be very conscious of what approach you take and how you communicate it to keep all stakeholders done. And another one, so just last one, is the other one that is very interesting is that last one on Exco. Several of the companies I've been involved with have, where they do it, have not thought about managers going back in, because they don't need to, they're comfortable, they can work from home. But there is something about this, about leading from the front, particularly when there is a risk, and it may be more perception than reality, but going back to the office, particularly via public transport, will be a scary thing. And I just wonder if enough firms thinking, are we going to have managers there to sort of stand up and be counted with the others that need to go to that?
Sorry, Keith, I'm just going to, there's a bit of background noise. I'm just going to mute everyone for a second, because I think there was a lot of noise there. Keith, so you need to unmute yourself there, but I think you might have reached.
I'd reached the crescendo. Yeah,
you've reached the crescendo. Very good.
Yeah.
So Richard, if I may just come to you on that first, then, and also Matt, because you both run, or you both have large office footprints where you have call center teams. You need to energize, you need to inspire, you need to lead. How, just reflecting on some of what Keith has said, how do you imagine that office of the future might then look?
I think I'm listening to Keith. I'm just sort of slightly goosebumply thinking that's exactly the challenge we're thinking about. I think there's a lot of people talking about it as some sort of bifurcation. You will or you won't. I don't think that's a sensible planning assumption or a sensible business model. I think, you know, there are distinct disadvantages by having everybody working from home. I actually can count, because part of my business is running call centers. What's my productivity loss? I know it's costing me about 25 FTEs worth of people, because call lengths are longer, shrinkage has gone up. I know what it's costing me. So that's to that point about, it's difficult, they don't have dual screens, all that sort of stuff. So there's definitely some disadvantage. Some of that we can correct. We can provide better working from home kit, but we can't do that for people, as Keith was saying, who are living in a tiny space with their partner, with 4 kids running around, and that's impossible. So there is no way that they can have a sustainable job doing those sorts of things. So my emerging view, no more than that, is that it will be some sort of blend, and we have got to work through how do we make that blend work for us as a firm and for individuals, and how do we recontract actually in this new, more flexible way of working. And I don't mean contract, I probably do mean it in a literal sense, as in what is the contract that people sign. And I'm not talking about going to 0 hours and that sort of nonsense, but how do we get more flexibility as a business and offer more flexibility back for our folks who definitely want that. And I think most people in that middle 70% are saying, I would love to come in a couple of days a week, but I'd love to work from home, and I want to work that through. Now, I mean, that's kind of where technology, I think, plays a part. I mean, we haven't had a workforce management tool, for example, because, yeah, it's nice to have, but we can kind of manage it with 500 people. You cannot manage a 500-person flexible workforce, on a spreadsheet. It's just not going to work. We also, I think there's this great opportunity for us to match up our customer demand hours and our people much, much better, because I've got loads of people saying to me, you know what? I would be really happy to give you 2-3 hours a day. That would suit me absolutely fine. It doesn't work when you're saying, oh, by the way, can you drive an hour each way to make that work? But when folks are at home, they're saying, that's great. That's what I want to do. And if I can match that with my customer demand patterns, that will give me a real productivity gain. So I think that's kind of an interesting option. So I think we're going to be in some sort of blend, which will then also mean that we've got 3 quite big, well, 1 smallish and 2 quite big spaces. So our offices are now significantly more than I think we're going to need. So I think there's a big question about, what do we want to be in? And this is not a Brightside is closing offices. It's just thinking about what is it we're going to need. And also, we've never had anything in London, but we do a great deal of our work in London. Lots of our teams are here. So I think we need to find some sort of flexi space. And the other thing I think we need to have in place with more flexibility is how are we going to make Brightside meet, and how do we do that? What do we do to bring people together as a whole company, which we actually didn't even do in our 3 offices. We tended to have the Christmas party for each of the offices, not the one. And I think those are the sort of things that we're going to be putting in place to bind people, if you like, into the one Brightside business, as opposed to I'm now just virtually working for someone somewhere that I don't feel connected to.
No, thank you, Richard. I think that will resonate with a lot of people, and I think it's part of that overall taking a pause and not just jumping straight back in. It's part of that thinking process there. Matt, if I may turn to you, there's quite a few questions coming on the chat on this. Without wanting to get too philosophical on you, what is the office now in your mind? What is the office that you envisage that EDAM or even some of your other businesses you look at? What is that going to be?
Yeah, I think for EDAM, the office won't lose its place as the hub of the business, and the engine room. I think that will inevitably be the case, because just the way that I say the culture of the business and the close team working, what have you, that's entailed in EDAM. It means it will always be helpful to have the office as the sort of centre of operations. But I do agree with Richard. I think it will have to take on a sort of hybridisation, if you like, and we'll have to rise to the challenge. I mean, the simple facts of it are, I think we've got something like 280 office-based headcount, and we can only fit 124 of them in on a 2-metre spacing base. So we're going to have to deal with the reality of that, and that will present some challenges, as I say. I think in terms of keeping the team working culture going, making sure people feel engaged. There are challenges to it around things like data security. Accident data has a commercial value. We do often get people trying to capitalize on that. So we need to keep our data very secure, and that does involve making sure we've got the right people in the office under the right controls for that as well. But I think we've got to see it on the opportunity side too. EDAM's not based in the most salubrious end of Manchester. Often recruiting people there is a difficult job. Maybe if we can offer people more of a hybrid approach to non-office working, then that broadens the talent pool we can draw from as we go about sort of reshaping the business and into the sort of projects of the future. So I think we've got to embrace all sides of that.
Yeah, and just thank you for that. I mean, just if I may come back to you, Keith, I don't know if you see some of the questions coming through on the chat, and I'll open it to the floor in a minute for other questions on this. But I mean, there's comments here. Do we think that flexi space is going to be more attractive for people and make them and will make for better working environments? Those traditional offices don't help working, as there are walls, barriers, decor, and it's not necessarily a nice place to be. Do you think we'll see a rise in that flexible space?
Yeah, I think we do. I think it's to Matt's point. I think the what is the office? It is a meeting place for central functions and thought sharing and technology. That doesn't have to be one central office. What you could see a lot more of, and banks have done this with their branches before, is you could have people working in hubs, not necessarily one central office. You could see a situation. One of the other consultancies I know has a big office out by Gatwick, and people who live in Sussex, rather than commuting up to town, could all congregate there for those communal activities that the office represents, rather than going to the one big office near the Shard. So I really do think that we need to think flexibly. I mean, I just thinking out loud there, Richard sort of saying we need space in London. Well, actually, the other way around, firms like M&G are going to be offloading space in London. So it's not necessarily going to the WeWorks and the collaboration between firms to optimize this, I think, will be a way forward. One of the things I picked up on one of these calls earlier was the collaboration between industries and typical competitors. And I think that's where we've got to start thinking separately. We all have a need to optimize this, and there are real opportunities for firms to work together and get sort of collective hubs. Now, the two downsides, of course, and one's to the office plan, is yes, offices are unforgiving, but the reality is, so if you go to a place, one of the firms I was talking to yesterday, where it is open plan, you are now having to put in perspex screens. So you're almost, for the safety reason, going back to the old traditional office to keep people safe, which is less appealing. So I think there is a balance there. And the other thing, as I think Jonathan said, is there is a hybrid problem. There is a half in, half out. We all felt very awkward when we were the one person on a video call or a conference call, and everyone was around the table giggling at you, or so you felt, right? You've got to get that right. They probably were in my case, to be fair, but you've got to get that balance right. So it's it's great to hear everyone's thinking about it, because I think that we really do need to think about this, because if we do jump back to one way or the other, it will be wrong.
Well, I think to add to that as well, Keith, I think people are going to have to be prepared and flexible around this being a very stop-go process. I don't think it's a case of we're just all back to the office and that the new model is then frozen. I've just been listening to Matt Hancock on the news talking with not 100% clarity on how the track and trace system is going to work. And if somebody walks into your office who tests positive, you've then got to send your staff back on isolation for 14 days. Well, that's best laid plans, punched in the face at that point, really, isn't it?
I'd like
sorry,
to.
Paul, I was just going to say on that point, look, we're talking obviously at Robert Half, and we're talking to people about staffing and remote working. So Robert Half have deployed somewhere around in the region of 90% of their interims globally are working from home on Surface Pros and laptops provided and supported by Robert Half, connected to Amazon Workspaces. It is a hybrid, but I think it's a habit that will stay. And I think for many businesses in many sectors, it will be a phased return. It's very much hot on the HR agenda at the moment. The number of issues that the phased return will present. Will there be another spike? Will there be a spike again later on in the winter? So we'll start having a return to normality, but then winter will hit and cases will be on the increase again. I think there are a number of challenges for businesses, but there's a couple of things I just wanted to say, conscious of time, Paul, but there'll be a number of patterns that emerge and changes. We will continue to evolve on this journey. It was interesting, we had Dave Jones, our regional director for Asia Pac, on Robert Half a few weeks ago, who said that actually China, who were 8 weeks ahead of us and went into lockdown on the 19th of January, had actually pretty much returned to normal, other than being able to buy yourself a test on the street corner for $25. Largely, operations were very much back to normal. Public transport were full. People were returning to offices. I think we've got to remember that we are humans. We like to have interaction. Building culture is all around people. We've heard today, I think, certainly from Richard and Keith and Matt, about how, how people are, the employee engagement polls are showing that there's a very mixed response. Some people are very, very keen to get back into the office. Some people less keen, but we are all in a temporary hiatus where we're working from home, and some of these habits will shift and move on and change.
Leda, thank you for that. I'd just like to open, and thank you all for the questions coming through on the chat. I think I've addressed a lot of them, but I'd just like to open it to the floor. And before we maybe just look at a risk angle to finish, any questions from the floor for Richard, Matt, Keith, or Jonathan? Okay, let me move it along then. As I say, there's a lot of chat here, kind of, reflecting on how the homework can give businesses an opportunity to focus more on outputs and deliverables, maybe rather than presenteeism. But one of the challenges that we see there, as you've talked about reimagining those businesses, is the change in risk and regulation associated with that. Jonathan, you mentioned that before. I'd just like to finish on that, because as we do imagine these businesses, we need strong risk stewardship to guide us through and make sure that those risks are managed. So Jonathan, I'll come back to you just to maybe to reflect on this at the end, but maybe Richard, if I could just start with you again, just to reflect on some of that and how you're looking to very briefly just look at some of those risks and new regulations.
I think obviously we're an industry with regulated by PRA, FCA, and obviously with a lot of government interest in also what we do. I think I think, to be honest, regulation in insurance has been very slow to change, and I think that some of the things that the regulators have insisted that insurance companies do for customers have simply not made sense to customers, and not quite sure at times who the FCA sometimes think they're actually trying to protect. And I think that there's going to have to be quite a dramatic change in the thinking of what sensible risk around customers actually means, and therefore how businesses are able to trade with customers. I mean, the number of businesses I work with where requiring a wet signature still sits in regulation. I mean, it's just so ridiculous. It's not true, but that is the way the industry is still operating. And unless you get a wet signature, it's not considered to be valid and binding in some cases. I mean, really, we're in 2020, and that's still part of regulation. So I think there's a lot to do for regulators and the industry to kind of rethink some of these things.
Thank you. Keith, if I may just turn to you for a brief reflection on that, both from an M&G and an Admiral perspective.
Yeah, I think we've hit it on the head. I mean, what this has forced risk professionals to do and businesses take a more commercial view of risk, and I think that needs to continue. So, the electric signatures, we've adopted some areas where we can, where previously the firm's policy or principle says you have to have a wet signature. Well, you don't. You just need. We've had one where, and the question is how you keep this going. A good example is advisors can now essentially sign off on behalf of that they are giving the customer full information rather than having to get it from the customer directly with a wet signature. And you think it through, and what is the real risk in that? There isn't much, but you've only been forced to do it because of this environment. And I think the key is you've got to take that commercial perspective going forward. Because otherwise we'll get just bound up in principle. It's got to be more principles rather than just tick box.
Absolutely. And Jonathan, I think that ties in with your vision of the CRO almost adopting, having a strong risk appetite as well as risk avoidance. Do you want to just conclude with a few comments around that?
Yeah, no. So I guess my general conversation around this has been that risk management is not the same as risk avoidance, and I think it often gets pulled together. So you look at an awful lot of risk functions where it's pointing out all the issues, the challenges, and the problems, and not looking at the risk profile, and at times saying, I think in certain areas we're not taking enough risk, and it's very rare to see a risk function that is actually suggesting the business needs to be taking more risk in certain areas and looking at risk profile in that way. And I think that's important, particularly in some of the types of areas we've been talking around with innovation. And I do talk about both compliance and risk functions. When I look at digital leaders, and we have a sort of model and a framework that we use that looks at a number of different areas, at how digital leaders, if you like, are very different than perhaps people earlier in that journey, and risk and compliance functions are two of those. And I think if you look at a digital leader, both risk and compliance functions are innovation teams and see themselves as that. So their role is to understand the strategy and the direction the business wants to go, understand clearly the concerns of the regulators and risk appetite of the organization, but then to try and find innovative solutions that enable the business to achieve what it wants to achieve, and see that as their role, as opposed to seeing their role as the function that points out all of the issues and the problems and comes up with the reasons as to why not. We had this in cyber security a few years back, where people always talked about the cyber functions going from functions that said no to functions that said how, And I think risk and compliance functions need to go through some of that same journey. We're going to achieve some of the things that we've been talking about today.
Jonathan, thank you very much for that. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to Matt, to Richard, to Keith as well, and to Layla. Thank you all for your contribution today. Thank you all to our attendees for the questions you've been asking. Really, really grateful for those. Hopefully we got to most of them. If we haven't, we'll pick them up offline. Our next forum is on Thursday, the 4th of June. We're looking to focus on retail there. So with the government opening the non-essential shops again, we're trying to get more of a retail perspective there and understand some of the challenges there, the adaptations that will be necessary. So all that it remains for me to do is thank you all once again to our panelists. Thank you all once again to our attendees. Please send us through your feedback, your questions, your focus areas. Thank you ever so much. Stay safe, and we'll speak to you again in a week's time. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.